Recently, a fascinating discussion took place between two individuals who are, without any exaggerations, the most credible and knowledgeable people on the subject of the Russian mindset. The first speaker is Alexander Nevzorov. Nevzorov and Putin share strikingly similar origins. Both were born in the same maternity hospital, both are nearly the same age, and both grew up on the streets of Leningrad, a city today known as St. Petersburg. In the 90s, both wielded a significant power in the local government. However, unlike Putin, Nevzorov is not a KGB agent, but a journalist. Nevzorov later became a member of the Russian state parliament. Today he is one of the most ruthless critiques of Putin's regime, living in exile. He openly admits to having escaped what he calls virus of Russian imperialism. He is personally acquainted with Putin and was involved in the highest echelons of Russian power. Now, the second speaker is Volodymyr Zolkin, a Ukrainian journalist who has conducted interviews with hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian prisoners of war. Zolkin has experimented with interview formats, pushing boundaries. He has brought Muslim Russians to Ukrainian mosques in search of redemption. He brought Christian Russians to Ukrainian churches for prayer in hopes of change of heart. He brought Russian pilots to the very sites of their bombings to confront and question their actions. In many interviews, Zolkin facilitates calls between POWs and their relatives to expose their reactions. Over the past 3 years, Zolkin has spoken to all kinds of Russians, from privates to colonels, from ex-convicts to elite Spetsnaz units, from Muscovites living in the capital to Buryats living in the furthest reaches of the empire. His YouTube channel serves as a repository for all those conversations and experiments. So thus, I dare to say that there are no one else on earth who understands the imperial Russian mindset better than those two people, Zolkin from the ground up, so to speak, and Nevzorov brings the insight from the top down. So together they form an unparalleled duo in dissecting the Russian mindset. In this video, I will translate key parts of their conversation for you, and I will add my commentary and context where needed. So, my name is Yaroslav, I'm from Ukraine. Welcome to my channel where I strive to expose the true face of Moscow Empire. I firmly believe that the better we understand our enemy, the more effectively we can counter them. They are not just a threat to Ukraine. They pose a danger to the entire democratic world. Through my videos, I aim to make this clear to Western audience, one video at a time. So, let's dive in. I will start this episode with how Nevzorov introduces Zolkin to his audience. What I admire about Alexander is his incredibly sharp mind. He uses intricate grammar with pinpoint precision to describe our reality. I'd even call him the artist of the word. His communication style often inspires me as well. You'll probably notice it in this introduction.
I'd
like to introduce you to a person who over the course of 3 years has amazed us all with the art of opening those horrifying tin cans called Russian prisoners, or rather to be more precise, orc prisoners. In a way, he has shown us a portrait of today's Russian people. Beyond everything else, I consider this a significant anthropological endeavor, because assembling such a collection of characters, uncovering their motivations, and showcasing their incredible wretchedness is, unfortunately, directly tied to whether we will be alive or dead tomorrow. We can see our reality unobstructed thanks to those experiments and trials that Zolkin conducts. Moreover, I've often imagined his next respondent being someone like Putin, but stripped of his usual rhetorical fluff. Beneath it all, would he be any different from an average Russian soldier? If his arrogance and pretense were peeled away, I would imagine he'd be just as hollow and just as meaningless. We'd probably see absolutely the same emptiness that he uncovers in his interrogations of Russian POWs.
Что мы видим на ваших допросах в лице русских пленных.
As you've just witnessed, Alexander Nevzorov calls Russians as orcs. I wanted to highlight the part of their conversation where he explains the logic behind this terminology. Also, to give you some context, He will mention Alexei Gorinov, a man who spoke out against the war and was sentenced for 7 years to a strict prison facility. Gorinov was charged with justifying terrorism. There is this powerful and tragic photo of him behind the bars with a poster saying, "Enough killing, stop the war," which I think depicts the reality of the empire really well. Now let's hear why Nevzorov calls Russians as orcs.
Потому что я же не случайно называю их орками, да?
I don't call them orcs by accident. I don't use the term to insult or offend, but I use it because this word captures their complete hysteria and obsession with suppressing anything remotely human or meaningful in life. For example, in Russia right now, they're placing an anti-war and courageous man, Gorinov, on trial. Do you know why they're judging him? They're judging him simply because he's not like them. The orcs are punishing a man for being human, for not being one of them. They hate him for his dignity and humanity, for not being rotten to the core, for speaking differently, for his anti-war gestures. Even the communists in the USSR were more honest and logical in their cruelty. They immediately recognized people of a different mindset as alien to their way of life. Back then, they'd just exile these different people from the Soviet system. It was harsh and despicable, but in its own twisted way, it had a kind of primitive logic, almost a perverse sense of honor.
Это было, в общем, в известной степени благородно.
In this segment, Nevzorov wonders if Zolkin has ever encountered a true warrior by nature. Later in their dialogue, this question will be spread out into multiple different threads.
Когда человек воин, когда человек зверь.
When a person is a warrior, when they are like a beast, fully dedicated to the art of war, akin Japanese samurais or Viking berserkers, perhaps, molded by some higher calling. Have you ever encountered even one such true warrior?
Нет, ну я сейчас буду обманывать, наверное, если скажу.
I'd be lying if I said there weren't any at all. Maybe there were a couple of those who really see themselves as warriors, fighting for the sake of war itself. But out of thousands, there were just a couple of such. Imagine what an insignificant percentage it is. Honestly, I did come across at least 2 completely rational young officers, lieutenants, who, when surrounded by ordinary Ukrainian farmers armed with whatever they had available, actually made a smart decision. They gathered their men, approached the locals, raised their hands, and surrendered. I've encountered a few people like that, people I can genuinely say were honorable, just normal, decent individuals. So yes, I believe there are still some people in Russia who somehow didn't completely fall prey to the propaganda machine. Perhaps these individuals can be called warriors, not exactly samurai, but warriors to some extent. However, this doesn't reflect positively on them from an intellectual standpoint. That much is clear. They never truly understood why they went to war, where they were going, or what they were fighting for. They never understood that. But the point is, from the beginning, they followed orders, believed it was their duty, and were ready to die for it.
Выполняли приказ, они считали это своим долгом и были готовы за это умереть.
In this segment, Zolkin questions whether Russians who take their own lives to avoid being captured could be considered as warriors. For the context, in the Moscow Empire exists a deep-seated cult of death. Death is glorified among all levels, in news programs, churches, and even kindergartens. Even a monument has been erected to glorify those who chose death over being taken as prisoner. I've also seen a photo of an instruction manual on how to properly pay the debt to the motherland. I can't say if this photo is real, but I would not be surprised if it is. Overall, this is quite a complex topic I plan to cover more in depth later, but as a result of this glorification of death and miserable living, it's not uncommon to see Muscovites ending their lives by pulling the trigger or detonating a grenade. This phenomenon has become so prevalent that it's been coined as Putin's farewell kiss. A researcher known as Glaud meticulously tracks those incidents through photo-documented cases, with his latest report listing 180 confirmed suicides, an average of 1.1 per day. The real number is likely much higher, as many cases go undocumented. Now, with that context in mind, let's hear what Nevzorov's perspective on this is. It's a viewpoint that I find absolutely brilliant.
россияне, которые стреляют себе в голову.
Russians who shoot themselves in the head to avoid being captured, could they be considered as warriors you're describing?
Нет, потому что...
No. In about 90% of cases, this is what we call an extreme pain response. The pain is so unbearable, whether from severe injuries, blood loss, or the realization that help won't come, that they see suicide as the only way to stop it. They think using a grenade or a bullet to end their suffering is a good solution. These people cannot be considered warriors in any sense. Also, let's not forget about the lies they tell each other. They live in trenches, terrifying each other with stories about how cruelly the evil Ukrainians will torture them if captured, how they'll shove hot needles into them or worse. This hysteria spreads and feeds on itself. They live in fear and don't realize that in reality, the worst thing that might happen to them in captivity is a missing piece of meat in their soup.
Я смеюсь, но украинцам это все очень больно слышать, но вы правы.
It's funny, but at the same time, very painful for us Ukrainians to hear. Still, you're right, that's exactly how it is. They do spread those myths that they'll be mutilated or tortured in Ukrainian captivity. It's a deliberate tactic.
Yes, this is a common tactic. Russia has always fought wars by using meat, throwing human lives at the problem. They've never valued their soldiers. And to keep these orcs from surrendering, it's only natural that they are fed constant fear. What's shocking is that despite living in the 21st century with access to the internet, at the touch of a button, they still believe those lies.
Что они запугиваются, люди, которые живут в 21 веке.
That question, whether Russians have true warriors by nature among their ranks, eventually led Zolkin to outline distinct categories of soldiers within the empire, classified by their motives for going to war.
Тип первый и самый распространенный. Называется он мобилизованный.
The first and most common category consists of mobilized soldiers, which can be divided into two subcategories: those who joined for money and those who joined to avoid jail, or sometimes both. Their motivation is further boosted by TV propaganda, portraying Ukrainians as bad. However, they cannot actually articulate why Ukrainians are bad, as they've absorbed this narrative mindlessly, often while drinking vodka in the background. Next category are the contract soldiers. Among them, there may be individuals who fit the image of a warrior, but the majority of contract soldiers are hooked into a system I call the mortgage trap. It's a tricky scheme where soldiers are offered almost everything they could want: housing for their families, a stable salary, benefits. But all of it is provided on credit. If a soldier ever refuses to follow orders or decides to quit, they risk losing everything. Not only would they lose their home, but they would also have to pay back all the debt. Essentially, they wouldn't just become homeless, but homeless and in debt, dragging their entire family down with them. These mortgage soldiers make up a significant portion of Russia's contract army. With their motivations tied entirely to material benefits, it's hard to see them as true warriors, as those have entirely different motives, unrelated to financial incentives. Then there are those who are recruited directly from prisons. Russia's so-called law enforcement system is now working at full capacity to quickly round up anyone they can. They'll drag someone to a police station and swiftly offer them a deal: go to war and die. Even the banking system plays a role, forcing people into debt through quick loans. To repay these debts, they have no choice but to enlist and go to war.
Кстати говоря, тоже, потому что очень быстро пытаются их загнать в кредиты, во всякие, а для того, чтобы расплатиться с кредитами, он снова-таки должен пойти и умереть.
Third law of stupidity states: a stupid person is the one who causes losses to others when he or she does not benefit and may even suffer losses themselves. Lo and behold, we witnessed an entire nation, in spite of its own demise, committed to pouring enormous resources into causing losses to others. The level of Russian intelligence just never ceases to amaze. I've actually watched many of those interviews with Russian POWs and was astounded at how they couldn't count simple digits, or how they were completely off at estimating Russia's population. You might remember actually this episode from the very first days of war, where a Ukrainian soldier noted how incredibly lucky we are. If Russians would be just a tad smarter, there would be no war because they would see how futile it is. So, in a very perverted sense, the uneducated are fighting to remain uneducated. The slaves are fighting to remain as slaves. The prisoners are fighting for their prison to remain intact. So, in this segment, I have compiled Nevzorov and Zolkin's reflections on this very topic.
Когда я говорил с первой волной,
When I spoke with the first wave of soldiers made up of contract troops sent off here with the pretense of training exercises, I was struck by how unbelievably stupid they were. Honestly, to appear like a genius compared to them, you'd only need the equivalent of 5 or 6 years of basic school education. It felt as though they had no education at all. We were amazed at how intellectually limited they seemed. We couldn't believe such ignorance was possible. We assumed the next wave, those who joined knowingly and with some understanding of what they were getting into, might be smarter. But I was both shocked and deeply disappointed to discover that the second wave was even dumber than the first. At least the first wave had some excuse. The most detailed explanation they received boiled down to, there are just a bunch of Nazis hiding in the forests. They won't resist much and will march straight to Kiev to show our strength. They're already waiting for us there, so we'll hold a parade, celebrate, and return home.
Вручную.
What we see is blind, primitive acceptance of the war and an utter inability to look beyond their TVs and think critically about what's happening. This intellectual stagnation isn't accidental. It's been cultivated. For at least 20 years, they've been systematically turned into obedient livestock, incapable of questioning orders or thinking for themselves. The result is a horrifying picture of a completely intellectually degraded and wooden-headed people. If they're happy living like this, so be it. But this intellectual stagnation ensures an endless supply of people for the front lines and guarantees perpetual wars.
так.
Yes, fixing this problem is nearly impossible. After 2.5 years of interacting with them, I finally understood that no matter how persistent or diligent I am, it's nearly impossible to influence such an intellectually stagnant population.
Интеллектуально атрофированный народ почти невозможно.
As you might be aware, the empire's economy is slowly but steadily moving towards collapse. To my big surprise, both Nevzorov and Zolkin think that a poor economy is not going to stop the war. To give you some context, currently, if you sign the contract with the military, you're promised 2 million rubles as a one-time payment and have a 200,000 rubles monthly salary, which is a 4 times larger salary than Empire's average. For Americans, based on average income, this would be an equivalent of making $12,000 per month and receiving $120,000 upfront. Insane amount of money for people to make with no education, no skills, and no experience.
Что будет в результате?
What will happen as a result of the so-called economic collapse? Putin uncontrollably runs the printing presses, flooding the economy with meaningless money, and he'll keep doing it over and over again. There will be a rapid, even more visible and bitter fall into poverty that will force those sitting on the sidelines, valuing their limbs, to show up to the war. War will become the only way to make a living. It will draw in hundreds of thousands more from the provinces and cities alike, impoverished, savage masses who are even easier to control with propaganda. These people, degenerated by alcohol, stripped of any prospects in life, with nowhere to turn, will only find war as their outlet. And let's be clear, I'm hardly one to feel sympathy or even pity for the orcs. But if anyone thinks that economic collapse, inflation, or the devaluation of the ruble will somehow stop them from going to Ukraine to fight or cause a decline in Russia's military production, they're mistaken. Unfortunately, none of that will happen.
Вот этот весь обвал экономики, инфляция.
I've long tried to explain to them, but it's pointless. I admit completely pointless to get through to them. I've tried to make them understand that the 1 million rubles they've been promised, the money they supposedly stand to earn, will either never materialize, or by the time they see it, it will be worthless, reduced to mere scraps of paper. And that's exactly where things are heading. Those insane promises of 1 million rubles need to be paid somehow, right? They'll just print the money and hand it out. But if anyone thinks that the economic collapse will somehow deter them from going to Ukraine to fight, or that it will weaken Russia's military production, they're mistaken. Unfortunately, none of that will happen. They'll keep going to war because this population is so profoundly intellectually disabled. I've seen firsthand that they can't comprehend what we're discussing here. They won't even hear it.
Все то, о чем мы с вами сейчас вот говорим, они не поймут, они этого даже не услышат.
Now, this part of conversation contains interesting analysis about empire's generals and why there will never be a military overthrow. Also, the speakers will mention this guy, Nikita Mikhalkov. He's basically just like a Moscovian Steven Spielberg.
Рассчитывать на разумность.
Hopes for some mythical generals to overthrow Putin are misguided. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. There isn't a single independent or strong-willed personality among them. A Russian general is the most humiliated, submissive, and degraded creature imaginable. To become a general under Putin, one must be completely devoid of personal qualities. One must be utterly sterile. Personal traits are seen as suspicious. So, of course, someone with personal traits would never be allowed to command 20,000 armed soldiers. Such a person would never be allowed to rise to the rank of general. It's delusional to expect otherwise. Case in point, there is this general of filmmaking, Nikita Mikhalkov, who publicly panicked and claimed that vaccines would implant a Bill Gates chip into his brain.
I agree, yes. I've often shown videos of Mikhalkov to prisoners of war asking for their opinions. I'd play clips of Mikhalkov ranting about laboratory-grown birds, allegedly sent to Russia to destroy not Russians but Slavs specifically. This speaks for itself.
There was also talk about biological weapons supposedly being tested on Ukrainian volunteers. Birds were allegedly infected with this weapon, and their flight paths over Russia were carefully calculated. This was described as an outright fascist attempt to exterminate the Slavic ethnicity as a whole. Попытка истребления вообще славянского этноса как такового.
Прокомментируйте, человек с высшим образованием.
Now, in this segment, Nevzorov wonders, how big of a role does religion play in justifying the motives?
Уровни религиозности этого всего.
I have a question for you. What level of religiosity do those herds of orcs you deal with exhibit?
Да и о религиозности...
Their religiosity operates at just the right level to justify things that otherwise cannot be justified. It doesn't boil over or create devotion. Instead, it simmers quietly, like murky water, where every so often a bubble rises, pops, and then everything settles back into stillness. What does this look like in practice? Phrases like, "only God knows," or "whatever God wills, so it shall be," dominate their thinking. This mindset serves as a perfect way to avoid any discussion or even the simplest of questions. For example, what is your son doing here in Ukraine? Why did he come here? What would you say if he died? These conversations are often not even with prisoners of war, but with their relatives. Their answers can be infuriating. If he dies, God will decide. Whatever God wills, so it shall be. Or, the church teaches us not to question such things. Even when confronted with the reality of their son killing people, they deflect. I don't know. I can't say. That's big politics. Their religiosity is on the same superficial level as their understanding of political processes, or any processes, for that matter. It serves as a way to justify their existence and provide simple answers to the few questions they dare to consider. This shallow faith helps them cope with their meaningless existence. It's a thin, superficial layer, a spiritual smokescreen over their usual ignorance and gray monotony. In the end, like everything else about them, their religiosity is woven from the same fabric of indifference and intellectual stagnation.
Помогают им влачить свое бессмысленное существование. Вот на этом уровне, да, на этом уровне у них религиозность присутствует.
This conversation focuses on the so-called Russian opposition to Putin. I completely agree with the points raised. Firstly, there is no genuine opposition to Putin. Secondly, those who imitate this opposition figures, such as Navalny and the recently exchanged Yashin, are cut from the same imperialist's cloth. They keep repeating a lie that it's only Putin to blame for the war, and they want to preserve the empire intact. Despite the fact that so-called opposition is against the war, they are still a disappointment and a disgrace.
Вот есть сейчас так называемая российская оппозиция. Я не знаю, как вы к ним относитесь. Я хотел бы...
Currently, there is the so-called Russian opposition, and they often repeat the mantra, "Not all Russians are like Putin. Don't paint everyone with the same brush." To that, I respond, "Sure, not all are like that. But why do you keep saying something that's already obvious? If you doubt me when I say almost all, then I have a question for you. How often have you actually talked to the bare-bone people from your provinces? I am not, nor have I ever been, a Russian opposition figure. Thankfully, I'm not Russian, nor am I tied to any of this. But unlike the opposition, I have spent 2.5 years speaking directly with these bare-bone people. How is it that a Ukrainian blogger and journalist knows this bare-bone people better than those who claim to speak for and represent them? Come and talk to at least 100 prisoners of war, let them pass through you, and only then decide whether they're not all like that, or if in fact most of them are. Their entire consciousness is wrapped in templates they don't even understand. These are the same templates that produce phrases like, "Whatever God wills, so it shall be," or "Politics doesn't interest me." The next template follows, "We'll never know the whole truth." To them, this is a genius response, as if it removes from them any responsibility to think critically. Well, surely no human knows the whole truth.
Но почему
Кроме
уже,
вас.
значит, всей правды никто... Вся правда, которая находится...
But why wouldn't anyone know the whole truth? The truth that lies within the realm of observable facts isn't hidden. Yet this so-called Russian opposition has turned out to be one of the most disappointing groups of all. They've carried with them the same blindness, the same grayness, and the same inability to overcome these traits within themselves. I often say that Russians are like a cult, bound by a single prejudice, a deeply racist belief that they are entitled to things to which others aren't. They see themselves as chosen, exceptional, and above the rules. This belief in their exceptionalism and special status runs deep, even within the so-called opposition, infecting it entirely.
Вообще, так называемая российская оппозиция оказалась...
Lastly, I'd like to highlight 2 points from their conversation. First one being about where Nevzorov delivers an incisive critique of religion, showcasing his verbal masterpiece. And another case where Zolkin discusses Russians' surprise upon them finding out that they have human rights.
Я понимаю, что верующих нет.
I understand perfectly well that true believers don't exist. Faith is a completely different state of being. It's a state where one doesn't need to exert effort to convince themselves or others of the correctness of archangels, or the possibility of a rabbi achieving a vertical ascent into the stratosphere after death. I can poke fun and mock such notions. After all, if someone doesn't want their religion to be ridiculed, they can always choose a less laughable one. Honestly, I don't see a problem with simply switching your religion.
Я люблю слушать вот эти. И к этому времени они уже успели пообщаться.
Time has passed since their capture, and the initial state of shock is long behind them. By now, they've come to understand their newfound value as bargaining chips in potential exchanges. During this time, they've had the chance to interact with representatives from the Red Cross and the UN, who have informed them about their rights. All of a sudden, they realize that they, as individuals, have rights, the right to speak or remain silent, to refuse an interview or agree to one. This newfound awareness begins to sink in, reshaping their understanding of what it means to be treated as a human.
Вопросы — это прерогатива правоохранительных органов.
Thank you all for watching. I do hope you found this conversation just as fascinating as I did. It made me understand a little better why a military coup in the empire is so unlikely. And, as we've heard, war is the bread and butter of so many Russians. The empire created a stable spiral of hell, with only escape being death. But I still cannot wrap my hand around what makes them say that a collapsing economy will not stop the war. After all, the collapse of Soviet Union was in big part due to the crumbling economy. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Also, big shout out to people who supported my work financially. To me, that is a clear sign that my work brings value and it motivates to make me more videos. Thank you very much. Peace through strength, my friends, and until next video.
but in your speeches and at your recent conference about what the United States should do to help Russia, and you've also pointed out what the consequences of not helping Russia will be. Would you share with us your thoughts?
Well, Russia at the present time is at a crossroads. It is often said that the Cold War is over and that the West has won it. That's only half true, because what has happened is that the communists have been defeated, but the ideas of freedom now are on trial. If they don't work, there will be a reversion to not communism, which has failed, but what I call a new despotism, which would pose a mortal danger to the rest of the world, because it would be infected with the virus of Russian imperialism, which of course has been a characteristic of Russian foreign policy for centuries.